Gorbachev looks around and says, "Oh, well, there's my old friend Peter." And Bush says, "Who's Peter?" And Gorbachev says, "Oh, he's a photographer for Newsweek magazine."
There isn't an international event of any significance in the past 30 years that Peter Turnley hasn't photographed. The award-winning photojournalist has done over 40 covers for Newsweek magazine and thousands elsewhere. We met him near his apartment in Harlem in New York City. Peter, I wanted to begin this by asking you about my sense, having looked at your work and read about you and everything, is that you're almost organically connected to a camera in your life. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about how that came about, because I understand from reading some background stuff on you and seeing a few things about you that it started when you were young and you were recovering from a sports injury, because you're a big football guy, I think, right? And your dad got you a camera. Is that where it began for you?
It's close to the story. I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and as a young guy, I happen to be a twin, and I have another older brother and older sister. In the very early days, I grew up in a house that was actually built for an Indian chief called Chief Richardsville. So it was a house that was up on a hill that was actually away from all other houses. So as a kid, I grew up in a really kind of isolated environment where my life really involved playing outside all the time with my brother. A lot of exploration, and then, and all in all, sports was the way that both of us really expressed ourselves up until the age of about 16. And we played every single sport. We were sort of obsessive about it. Football was our favorite sport, but we played every season: football, basketball, track, baseball, hockey, and I loved football. I played linebacker. I was a punter. I'm actually kind of proud because I think it was a 41 or 2 yard average in punting in high school. And when I was a junior in high school, I had a serious knee injury. Yeah. And I have to say, and I'm kind of almost ashamed to say this, that up until that point, I would have thought that standing on the sideline, photographing a game as opposed to playing it, was a sort of a sissy thing to do. I couldn't imagine that. But there was a guy on the football team that was a guard. He was a sort of a macho, well-built guy, and he happened to also be the high school newspaper and yearbook photographer. And when I was in the hospital with this knee injury, my parents brought me this book of photographs by the great French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson. Yes. And I don't know how they had the good notion to even know who that person was in Indiana at that time, but laying in this hospital bed, looking at this book of photographs, I was really moved by how this person's images informed me with the idea that if you keep your eye and your heart open, that in the continuum of daily life, moments that we walk by generally every day and don't pay attention to, that there are all these sort of Cartier diamond moments laying in the rough. And with the example of this friend of mine on the football team that was a high school newspaper, I began to think, well, maybe I ought to buy a camera and look into this. And so I did. I bought a camera. And
what kind of camera? Do you remember what it was?
I keep wondering about this, and it was either a Mamiya or a Pentax. Okay. And this nice guy on the football team also showed me how to use the darkroom. The high school had a darkroom. And now suddenly, for the first time in my life, I had lots of time on my hands after school, which I had never had before. I'd been involved in a sports practice every night of the year. Now I had 3-4 hours of time on my hands. There were many other things, though, that I think were kind of essential to my start in photography. In spite of the fact that I was very obsessive about sports, I grew up in a family, I come from a state that's one of the most conservative in the country. But that said, my own family was quite progressive politically. My father was someone who was very passionate about civil rights. There was a lot of discussion at the dinner table about the world, about social issues, a lot of talk about the haves and have-nots. And my father always sort of accentuated the idea that one ought to try to do something with one's life that made the world a little bit of a better place. And I happened to also be going to a high school that was one of the first high schools integrated racially by busing in the state of Indiana. I don't know if you remember or have seen the movie Remember the Titans, which took place on the East Coast, but the story of my high school was very close to that, except that there was none of the violence in the scene of my school that was related to that movie. Actually, the integration went down quite smoothly. And I thought that being a part of a student body that was very diverse was a great thing. I thought it was a wonderful thing. I felt very lucky to be going to this school.
You were absorbing all of this stuff because I mean, for most of us at that age, if that's going on around you and the family's having these discussions and everything, sometimes it tends to just sort of do that, you know? But no, I gather that it was having an impact on you.
I was a relatively, I would say, sort of shy person at that point. I don't know if I spoke a lot vocally about the things that I was thinking about, but I was very aware of the world. It was also a time that was extremely dynamic. The Vietnam War was going on. It was a time, unlike today in many ways, if anybody has an honest memory of the late 60s, when there was a true generational conflict, almost anyone my age or someone just a few years older than me really embraced values and ideas that were not the same of their parents. And besides that, the civil rights movement was raging on. It was the time of the beginning of feminism. So it was a very dynamic time, and I was very much aware of that. It was a time when people even physically were starting to look different. They were growing their hair longer, wearing different kinds of clothes. Music changed. And so I bought a camera, and now with this time on my hands after school, I also was somewhat, I think, motivated by the fact that while I said that the integration of my school went down very smoothly, and I thought the diversity of my school body was a great thing, I had a lot of black friends on my sports teams, but I was a little frustrated that I had a sense that at the end of the day I would go home to my white middle-class suburb and they would go back to the inner city of my hometown. In many ways we really didn't know each other that well. And so I bought this camera, and every night after school I started to drive down to the inner city of my hometown, Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is a city that's about 175,000 people, a very classic industrial American city. And I would go essentially to the black inner city of my hometown. And the camera became immediately sort of one of two things. It became first a sort of a pretext for me to enter new worlds. Yeah. It was a real coming of age for me. I started to go to pool halls, taverns, gospel churches. I'd enter people's homes. And the camera opened up doors. And then secondly, and maybe the most important thing, it was an opportunity for me to share a response to what I was feeling, what I was discovering, to share a response with myself, with my family, and with others. And I think in many ways, photography has always been that for me. At its core, it's not really about cameras, it's not about technique, f-stops, film or digital. It's about sharing my feelings and my perceptions about the things that I see and I encounter with myself and with others for now and for time.
I'm curious when you say that the camera at that point opened things up for you and that you actually got into people's homes and that sort of thing, because I think my first reaction would be most people would go, oh no, don't, you got a camera, man, don't, I don't want you taking pictures of me, I don't want you in my house. I mean, was it your age, do you think, that you weren't threatening, you had a camera, these people might have known you?
Well, I think there were a couple things that were part of my approach from the very outset. I've never studied photography. I took a 2-week photo workshop the summer between my junior and senior year of high school, and had a teacher in that workshop, a guy named Gabriel Delobe, who's from Belgium, who I don't know how he got to Fort Wayne, but luckily he did for us. He's still alive today. He's a wonderful man, still an active photographer. And he taught me 2 or 3 things in a 2-week period of time that have stayed with me all my life. The first thing was, he took me aside one day and he said, Peter, have you ever thought about all the time you spent walking around looking at the ground? And I thought about that, and I realized that I actually had done that quite a bit. I was shy, I was a little anxious, I might even have been a little angry. I remember that I walked from class to class, probably not looking at my classmates in the eye and looking at the ground. And I said, well, I probably do that quite a bit. And he said to me, listen, I want you to sort of buy into a contract. He said, for the next 2 weeks, every time you find yourself looking at the ground, I want you to just lift your head. And he said, if you do that, you'll discover that the world will feel like it has potential for you, and that you'll get out of your own mind, you'll get out of your own ideas, your own obsessions, and suddenly, if you keep your eyes and your heart open, the gifts of life that are free for all of us will begin to enter your life. He said, I want you to do one thing. The next time you find yourself looking down, just lift your head. Well, to this day, whenever, now at my age, throughout all of these years, if I find myself ever looking down when I'm walking down, it's like an alarm bell goes off and I just lift my head. And it really is almost a form of therapy.
It is it's a great piece of advice.
It's amazing. The second thing that he said to me was, he said, about the second day of this photo workshop, he said, now I want everyone to take one roll of film, 36 exposures, a roll of black and white Tri-X film, and I want you to go downtown Fort Wayne, Indiana, and when you come back, I want there to be a picture of a person on every frame of the roll. And he said, the most important thing is, he said, you're going to be nervous when you think about photographing somebody. But he said, when that happens, I want you to do it. Because if you don't, it'll be harder the next time. And if you do, I guarantee you it'll be easier the next time. He said, so if it helps just to have you say to yourself, Gabe told me to do it, do that. So, and he said, don't argue with me, just buy into the contract and do it. So I remember I went downtown that day, and as expected, I was nervous when I thought about raising the camera to photograph somebody, but I did exactly what he said. I did it, and I realized that after doing it, that the world didn't change, nobody cut off my head, life went on, and I learned to forget myself. That was one of the first things. The second thing that I don't know where I picked up on this, but I discovered almost immediately that people have an amazing ability to suss out friend from foe. We have this almost like animalistic instinct of who we like, who likes us, and who we should be afraid of, or who we should be beware of. And if you've ever thought about, for example, a dog that's barking, if you turn and run away from a dog that's barking, about 99% of the time it'll bite you. But most times if you stand and are calm and look at it, it'll calm down. And very early on, I discovered that that people like to be honored, they like to be admired, they like to be liked, and that it's very hard for someone to dislike someone that's willing to look them in the eye and smile and be calm. So from a very early age, when I would go down to the inner city of Fort Wayne, in the first instances that I would photograph people, I would look them in the eye and I would say, do you mind if I take your picture? And they would say, why? And I'd say, well, I think you have a really interesting face. I think you're a really nice looking person. You're really appealing to me. I would like to make a photograph of you. And most often people would say, fine, that would be okay. And I have one photograph of one of my first photographs that I made of a African-American gentleman on a porch with his two sons. And it was a moment just like that when I'm sure that I said to him, you're a really nice looking guy, do you mind if I take your picture? And he said, that's all right. And from that point on, I didn't say anything. And what has always struck me is I never tell people what to do in front of a camera. I learned very early on as well that there's nothing I could say that would ever allow people to organize themselves better in front of a camera than by just letting them organize themselves the way they would want to be seen.
Yeah, you can't direct them. You can't. You couldn't say. You would never say to somebody, "Look a little more pathetic," or whatever. You would never.
No, I like to spend time in front of people, but I do think that it's very important. I now often enough teach photography workshops where I encounter people that are grappling with the process of photographing people. And I always tell students, there are two possibilities. You can look someone in the eye and be calm and smile and be sincere with them. And then they have a choice to either allow you to make a photograph or not. But one way or the other, by virtue of the fact of honoring them, by looking them in the eye, they're most often not going to be upset. But on the other hand, if you take a picture and you turn away, someone's going to feel like you've just taken
Yes.
something from them,
You've robbed
and you,
Yeah.
they're aware immediately that you're not comfortable with yourself, and if you're not comfortable with yourself, they're not comfortable with you as well.
Yeah.
And so, and I've seen this many times. There's a second dynamic also, which is different from that, and that is photographing a moment where you see a story, you see an interaction in life, and you don't want to intrude on that moment. You don't want to affect it. You don't want to change it. And the desire then would be to be as discreet and unobtrusive as possible in the sort of Cartier-Bresson decisive moment spirit of photography.
Yes.
And that's another facet of image making that is close to my heart, that happens also often enough in my work.
You know, I'll ask you this question now. I was actually going to save it for later on in our conversation, but it seems appropriate now to ask you about it. But are there moments when you see your presence and the presence of your camera as affecting the situation that you're in front of, and would you refrain from taking a photograph if you thought that it was going to alter something in a way that would make it, I don't know if artificial is the right word, but I think you know what I'm talking about. Is there a point where you would not take a picture because of that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it's very important to me to, first of all, I always like to say that I feel that the themes of life and the people that I photograph are much more important than my photographs in photography. The photography is my method. It's a tool for me to communicate the things that I care about. Generally, almost always, if someone tells me not to make a photograph, I might ask them why. I might try to talk to someone, but if they don't want their photograph taken, I generally don't do it. But I have discovered that in the process of photographing people whose lives are in the midst of tremendous hardship all over the world, that most often people that are suffering in that kind of moment, a dynamic where they feel that something has happened to them that is unfair, that is unjust, or that they would like other people to know about, that they don't want their life and their predicament to be a secret. They would like other people to be aware of it. They would like people to see it.
Yeah.
And most often I think that even in the hardest moments, that with the right approach, with the right quiet sort of just visual exchange, that people understand that what you're doing is trying to honor and to make other people aware of their plight.
Yeah. So tell me how those men that you met and the work that they did informed you subsequent to that in your career.
Well, I'm not exactly sure where it came from, but from a very early age, I understood that it was important that I would seek out the people whose work I really admired the most and what they communicated about the world touched me in a profound way, that it would be somehow a great thing for me just to be touched by their spirit, to be in their orbit. So I actively made a point of trying to meet many of my heroes. I went to Paris in 1975. I was a junior in college, and at that time, while I was doing a program in French political science at a very good school of political science, I went to a photography lab called Picto, where Cartier-Bresson's prints were printed. And I had never studied photography, but when I was there that day, and I saw these wonderful prints of images that I had known since I first began photography, and I saw the men and the women wearing the sort of white sort of doctor's gowns that had made these prints, discussing the values of gray in a print. I remember saying to myself, I want to be a part of this. And so after I went back to the University of Michigan, where I majored in French literature, I had this singular desire that I was going to go back to France and live. And so I also had seen something that I think was fairly important. That was that when I went to Paris the first time, I met several young Americans that had gone to Paris dreaming of being the next great American author. Yeah. But after 2 or 3 weeks, they would run out of money and have to go home. Yeah. And I didn't want that to happen to me. So I went back to home to Indiana when I graduated from college, and I worked on a highway road crew building concrete highways for a year. My room and board was paid for, and I saved every penny I made for that year. It was hard work. It was hard physical work. Most of my friends actually probably couldn't have done this work. I was in really great physical shape back then, and I would swing a sledgehammer all day, lift big concrete forms. But I enjoyed being outdoors. I liked the men that I worked with that were mostly working class men from either Appalachia or a lot of African American men from the Deep South. And I learned during that year of work on the highway road crew, I actually also really learned the spirit of the benefits of hard work. But I had this dream of going back to Paris and working as a printer in this photo lab. And I did that. In the fall of 1978, I landed in Paris, and I went straight to the photo lab, and I met the man that had been the founder of this lab. He was a wonderful gentleman named Pierre Gassman, who was an East German Jew who had immigrated to France before the war, and had been a photographer himself. And then he encountered the first four Magnum photographers, Cartier-Bresson, Robert Capa, David Seymour, and George Rogers, and he started to print for them. And little by little, he founded this wonderful photography laboratory called Picto, where Cartier-Bresson's prints were printed for generations, and the prints of Joseph Kudelka and many other great European photographers' prints were printed there. So I got a job working as a printer in this lab. I remember the man who printed for Cartier-Bresson for 35 years is a man named Voja Mitrovic, who lives in Paris today. He's a Serb from Bosnia who immigrated to Paris in 1967. And on my first day, Pierre Gassman had this sort of gruff demeanor, but he loved people that were passionate about photography, and it was just a sort of a tough love demeanor. He went on to be a real sort of father figure to me. Yeah. But I remember the first day he said, "Okay, what do you know how to do as a printer?" And I said, "I can do everything. I'm a great printer." And he said, "Well,
really? You said that?"
He said, I said I can do everything. And he said, "All right, well, I'm going to give you a 3-day tryout. Let's see what you can do." And they gave me 100 negatives and wanted me to print 100 negatives 8x10 the first day. So I went into the lab that first day, and with about an hour to go, I had only printed 20 negatives. And Voja Mitrovic, the great Cartier-Bresson printer, came up to me and he said, "So how's it going?" And I said, "Well, I've only printed 20 negatives." He said, "You're never going to get this job. Give me the negatives." And he took the 100 negatives, and at 4 o'clock, he went to his enlarger, and I watched him print 100 negatives in a row without developing a single print. And each time he'd put the piece of paper in the drawer. And at 10 till 5, at closing time, he took the 100 prints, he went to the developing tank, and he chain developed 100 prints. They were all perfect, and he threw them all in the fixer. And at 5 o'clock, Pierre Gassman walked in and said, "So how'd you do?" And I said, "Well," Voja said, "We'll take a look." And he put his foot on the pedal, and the red light turned on, and Gassman went through the 100 prints and said, "Wow, you're as good as you say. You've got the job." And I took...
Would you feel at all... I mean, I would be racked with nerves and guilt at that point, thinking, Jesus, I just lied to this guy.
No,
it didn't bother you?
I have no idea what I was... All I know is that I was glad that I got the job, and that I knew I was going to be a good printer, and I knew I was going to be a hard worker. And I took Voja aside that day, and I said to him, I said, "Voja, you're never going to regret that. I'm going to make that up to you." And I remember him saying to me, "Peter," he said, "We're both immigrants. I came here in 1967, didn't speak a word of French, and you're a young American guy, and I just want to see you get a good start." And Voja and I have been friends now for the last 35 years. He's one of my closest friends. He also prints my photographs today.
Is that right?
And I'm extremely fortunate because he's probably the best photographic printer in the world.
Wow. Paris, I mean, you mentioned this to me earlier before we started our conversation, and it was something that I wanted to ask you. I mean, we're standing here on a street in Harlem, in New York. You could, I'm sure, easily be living in Midtown Manhattan if you wanted to, but you chose to live here. I assume because of the vibrancy of the life that goes on here and the people that you've introduced to since we've been here to talk to you. But that being said, your real home is Paris, isn't it? I mean, spiritually and physically too.
Well, I have lived in Paris full time since 1978 up until about 2001. In 2001, I received a Nieman Fellowship to do a year fellowship at Harvard. It's a wonderful program given to 12 American and 12 foreign journalists every year. And it was the first time I had been back in America full time for almost 20 years. And while I love Paris, and my heart does have a very direct connection to life in Paris and to French life and culture, I really enjoyed being back in the States that year. And when that fellowship was over, 9/11 happened.
Yeah.
I came to New York. I was one of the few photographers that spent the whole night of 9/11 at Ground Zero.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that later too, yeah.
And I discovered being back in America, as I mentioned earlier, I grew up in the Midwest, but I left at a relatively early age. I left Indiana when I went to college, and in some ways I never really looked back. In spite of the fact that I think my roots have a lot to do with who I am as a person, I really wanted to go out and discover the world. And in the last, now I suppose, almost 30 years, I ended up traveling to more than 90 countries around the world. From about 1984 to the present, I had an insatiable desire to discover the world and to go almost anywhere. And the harder it was to get somewhere, the more I wanted to go there.
My understanding too, tell me if this is true or not, but I've been told that in Paris, when you had your arrangement with Newsweek, which went from, 84 to 2003? 2001. Over that period of time, you listened to the BBC every hour, no matter where you were, no matter what you were doing, to hear the world news, and that you had this arrangement with Newsweek where you could literally just pick up and go. Is that true?
Well, it was close to that.
Yeah.
It was not exactly like that, but the way it worked was actually quite different than what most people think of when they think of their image of a photographer or a cameraman. I think there's a notion that often that photographers and television cameramen are dispatched. Well, that may be true for a lot of people, but the relationship that I had with Newsweek was amazing. It was surreal almost, to the extent that it was expected of me that I would make an analysis of world news each week. The form of the magazine is a weekly news magazine. And as it happened, I mentioned that I had never studied photography, but I did do a graduate degree in international relations in political science at a really good school in Paris called Sciences Politiques. I was actually a classmate of Sarkozy, the French president, in 1981 in a small economics conference. And I went to a school that almost anyone who's anybody in French politics would have had to have gone there. It's kind of the Harvard of France. And I was one of the few Americans to enter this school and to actually graduate. I've always been quite proud of that. A lot of people don't know anything about that part of my life in my profession, but I had developed a real passion for the study of world history and world affairs and geopolitics. And when I started to work as a freelance photographer in 1981 with a photo agency called RAFO in Paris, one of the first things that I became aware of was that at that time I was working strictly freelance, and I discovered right away that writers need good story ideas, and that if I wanted to have the opportunity to do photographs for various newspapers and magazines, that one of the ways that people would want to have me around was that if I had good ideas. And so while I had this fascination for the world, and it was a really exciting time. It was the height of the Cold War. Here I was in Paris, only a couple hours from the Berlin Wall, where on the other side of the wall was a whole world that the West had very little knowledge of. It was also a time where there was a lot of activity in the Middle East and in Africa and in Asia as well. And I could not have been in a better spot than Paris in terms of a platform for covering the world.
Yeah.
And so I would wake up every day and I would read 4 newspapers a morning, and I would listen to the BBC World Service almost every hour. And the BBC was terrific, particularly by virtue of the fact that I was in Paris, because it didn't have an only American perspective on the world. It had a sort of more independent view of the world. And given the kind of stories that I was going to be interested in that were international stories, the lineup of stories on the BBC was a tremendous sort of indication of a sense of priority. And so that was often a really important sort of clue to me. But so I developed this early practice of calling up the writers at newspapers and magazines like the New York Times, Newsweek, Time, some French newspapers and magazines, places where I wanted to work. And daily I would give story ideas. And in the early days, from 81 to 84, I developed a real tight relationship with the Paris bureau of the New York Times. I was close friends with all the bureau chiefs and the writers for the Times. And I gave many story ideas to stories that were literally page 2 stories in the Times at that time. So people liked having me around. Often the story ideas that I gave weren't going to make necessarily very good photo stories, but it was a way of keeping a foot in the door and wanting people to have me around.
Yeah.
Well, in 1984, I had a real lucky break. Newsweek magazine sent me out to Normandy. Bureau chief at the time was a gentleman named Fred Coleman, and he and I had developed a nice relationship. He appreciated my ideas, my work, my spirit, and he sent me with a writer out to Normandy for a month. Now that was a kind of an assignment that would be almost unheard of today with reduced budgets.
Yeah.
But I went out for a month, and here I was in front of a story, a theme, which was D-Day, 1944, one of the most glorious days of American military history in the 20th century. And I had just now spent several years studying world history, and here I had an opportunity in a direct way to hear the human stories of not only American veterans, but French people that had been living on the coast the day of D-Day, English, Australian, Canadian soldiers, German veterans. And I really put my heart into this story. I came back to Paris with a set of pictures after a month out in Normandy. And I recall that Catherine Graham, who was the owner of Newsweek and the Washington Post, happened to be in Paris that day. And I came into the office and I showed my pictures from Normandy, and Fred Coleman, the bureau chief, looked at the images and he turned to Mrs. Graham and he said, "Mrs. Graham, I'd like you to see Peter Turnley's images from Normandy. Just came back from a month." And she picked up the slides and she looked through the images in a slide sheet, and she landed on an image of an American soldier who had been a veteran of D-Day that was kneeling in front of a white pearl cross in the American cemetery. And she looked up at me and she said, "This will be the cover of Newsweek this week, both internationally and domestically."
Oh, man.
And I recall that after that moment, I went to a little office in the Newsweek bureau in Paris, and I closed the door and I sat down. And I remember I had a little cry. I remember looking at the ceiling of the office and thinking that this guy from Indiana, that with the end of my finger, that something I had done was going to touch 30 million people around the world the next week. And in many ways, it never got better than that. I went on to produce 43 covers for Newsweek in the next following 18 years. And it was always a tremendous motivation in terms of a sense of purpose, to think that what I would do was going to touch the lives of a large number of people. It was a very powerful feeling.
Now, you have stories that I want to ask you about. Maybe we should go somewhere else and sit down, because there are specific things that you mentioned 9/11, and I want to ask you about that, but there are other things I want to ask you about too. Want to go somewhere else and continue this?
Sure.
All right, let's do that.
Great.
Right.
When we come back, we go to Terry's Tri-Star Barbershop on Lenox Avenue, and Peter Turnley talks about some of the remarkable relationships he developed over the course of his career.
Peter, you've got certainly lots of stories about the places you've been, and it's quite evident for anybody who looks at your biography that you've been a witness to some of the most astonishing things internationally in the last couple of decades, if not more. And I want to ask you about a few of those. You were talking earlier about the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain and that world that was beyond it at the time that few of us knew about. My understanding is that for the longest time you were one of, if not the only, accredited Western photojournalist in the Soviet Union. Is that right?
Right. Starting in 1986, I received a full accreditation, multiple entry visa to be Newsweek's accredited photographer in the Soviet Union. To clarify, there was actually one other photographer at that time, a photographer for Time magazine. But it was a very rare opportunity to enter this world that, unless you were a journalist based in Moscow, that most journalists never had access to. So I started to make many trips to Moscow starting in '86. And I worked in the Soviet Union and then Russia from '86 to essentially 2001, and I made dozens and dozens of trips there. Traveled throughout the whole country. It was an amazing time. Gorbachev came to power in the mid-'80s, and as we all know, his policies of perestroika and glasnost began to really have an effect not only on the people of the Soviet Union, but on life throughout Eastern Europe. I became somewhat of a Gorbachev specialist. Everywhere he traveled overseas for almost his whole mandate, I followed him.
You photographed him more than anybody else, didn't you?
I imagine I photographed him more than anyone except possibly his own personal photographer.
Yeah.
But, you know, it was at a time when I had this sense that this rare opportunity, this almost sort of luxury to be able to have exposure, to witness this world that people only spoke about in the West, that I had a certain responsibility to communicate the realities. And not only the realities that corresponded to the difficult regimes that were in place, but also the realities of humanity, of daily life. There were, aside from the tough regimes that were there, it was a world of wonderful people and a lot of daily life that in many ways resembled that of the West. And in this kind of family of man spirit, I felt it was incumbent upon me to really show the whole spectrum of what life was like there then.
Yeah. Did you develop any kind of personal relationship with Gorbachev?
Little by little, over a period of about 6 or 7 years, he would see me all the time.
Yeah.
And he began to recognize me. He learned my name. And there was one sort of key moment, I would say, when everything kind of changed. It was very almost cinematographic. He took part in a summit in Washington, D.C. with, I believe it was Bush Sr. And it was at a time when the biggest story in the world was the Cold War American-Soviet story, and the arms talks were, the SALT talks, the nuclear arms talks were key. And access to these summits was very difficult. And one particular trip that he made to Washington, D.C., I managed, and I still don't really know how. The Madison Hotel in Washington, D.C. Was where all the Russian dignitaries were staying, including the Russian press corps and the Russian foreign minister, and on and on. And so the Madison Hotel had made everyone that was not Russian leave the hotel at that point. And I knew that that's where the Russians would be, and I knew that access to this summit was going to be better for me, that if I could potentially get better access through the Russian contingent of this visit, which was kind of ironic being an American Western photographer for an American magazine.
Right.
And I managed to get a hotel room at the Madison Hotel, and they didn't kick me out. They let me stay there. And there was one particular, the security back then was, the Soviet security and sort of KGB-like security, as one can imagine, was incredible. It was very dark age. These long lines of black limousines. The Secret Service agents wore these black fedora hats. It was very imposing, very James Bond-like.
Okay.
And there was one chief of security for Gorbachev that I always would see that was an incredibly intimidating guy. I don't know what his name was, but I always thought of him as sort of Igor, and he was just this huge guy that had this mole on his cheek. And several times prior to this particular visit, he had made my life relatively difficult. So one night, I recall, in the midst of this summit, I was going to the bar of the Masson Hotel for a nightcap, and I see Igor and the whole contingent of Soviet Secret Service at the bar, and the first thing I say to myself is, no, this isn't a good place for me to be right now. I'm gonna turn, and I turn to walk away, and the chief, Igor, the chief Secret Service agent, calls over in Russian, says, "Come here a second." So I go up to the bar, and Igor turns to the bartender and says, "Zva vodka, two vodka." And the American bartender pours 2 glasses of vodka, and he raises one, he hands me the other, and he toasts, and we put it back. And he says to me in Russian, and there was a translator, he says, "I've been watching you now for 4 years. And after all of this time, I think you are very professional. Na zdarovye." And he toasts to me. Well, amazingly, from that moment on, everything kind of opened up. And every time I would see Gorbachev in a foreign visit or in Moscow, suddenly my access got better. And little by little, Gorbachev would walk by me and literally stop and say, "Hey, Peter, how you doing?" in Russian. And one of my most, I would say one of the most ironic moments of my whole career was that during a summit in Washington, D.C., in the White House, there was a moment between Bush Sr. and Gorbachev. Bush Sr. recognized Gorbachev's personal photographer, who was this really big guy. And in the middle of a press call, he sees Yuri, the Russian photographer, and says in English, "Oh, there's my old friend Yuri." And Gorbachev looks around and says, "Oh, well, there's my old friend Peter." And Bush says, "Who's Peter?" And Gorbachev says, "Oh, he's a photographer for Newsweek magazine."
You gotta love it.
And
oh, the irony.
I always thought it was amazing being introduced to an American president by
a Russian president.
A Soviet premier.
That's incredible. Okay, the other thing I wanted to ask you about, because I know that you have some very vivid stories to say about this. And you mentioned it earlier in our conversation. You talked about coming back here, and you talked about 9/11, and you were at Ground Zero overnight, the day of, into the day of the 12th. Tell me what you saw, and tell me how that came about. How did you manage to pull that off, given what was going on at the time?
Right. Well, I was actually in Cambridge, in Boston, the morning of 9/11, and I was going to be, in fact, a teaching fellow for a Harvard class that fall, a class called the Literature of Social Reflection, and we had a meeting with all the teaching fellows, and a cook came running into the room in the morning and said, "You all got to get out of here. Our nation is under attack." And I remember thinking, who is this kook? And then he went on to say, two planes have hit the World Trade Center, another plane has hit the Pentagon, and a fourth has crashed in Pennsylvania. And the professor, Robert Coles, dismissed the group and said we should all go home. I go running home. And no one, I knew that there were more great photographers living in New York City than probably anywhere in the world, and there was no sense that anyone needed me to be there. I knew that there would be tons of images being made, but my whole body and sort of life went on autopilot. There was no question that I needed to get to New York. This is just a sense that I needed to participate, that this is sort of who I am, and this was and so I rented a car, and I drove to New York that afternoon. And I actually didn't really know where the World Trade Center was. I knew it was in Lower Manhattan. I didn't know the roads around New York. And as I got around New York, the traffic was bumper to bumper. And I put my window down, and there was a taxi, a Puerto Rican taxi driver was next to my car, and I said, "Hey, do you know how to get into the city?" And he said, "Yeah, follow me, that's where I'm going." And I thought, great, if anybody will know how to get there, it'll be him. So we drive for about an hour. I didn't know where I was. Now I know I was on the Cross Bronx Expressway, and at one point he stops his car, and he gets out, and he comes to me, and he says, "Hey, I'm going home. There's no way to get into the city." And I remember thinking, well, if he can't do it, I don't know what I'm going to do. And so I was sort of let down. I turned my car down a road, and just kind of mechanically I get to the end of the street, and there in front of me is Manhattan. There's a bridge, and I see a barricade of a lot of police. And I always, in my camera bag, I had a lot of press passes from around the world. And I looked at my press passes and I saw one that said NATO from Kosovo with my identity picture on it. And I thought, well, I'll try this. So I pull up to this barricade and I put the window down and I just raise this press pass, and cop comes up and says, NATO? He says, hey, Ralph. And he calls this second person over, and Ralph comes over and he says, what do we do with this guy? He's with NATO. And Ralph says, Jesus Christ, they're here already? And he says, hey, let him through. And he says, just be careful. So they pull the barricade aside, and I drive into Manhattan. And now it was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I stopped in Harlem, actually, and I hadn't had anything to eat all day. And I came in, and I had all my cameras on my shoulders. And what struck me was, in this pizza joint in Harlem, at least 5 or 6 people came up to me and, seeing my cameras, knew where I was going to go and patted me on the back and said, yeah, we know where you're going. Be careful. We're thinking of you. It was very touching, the sense of fraternity in the city that day. So I drive south, and I didn't know what the situation was. I didn't know that at 4 o'clock in the afternoon that the New York City police had declared this the biggest crime scene in the history of the United States. And they had a 4-mile perimeter around Ground Zero was closed, and all journalists were evacuated. So when I got near, I drove south, and I got to about Canal Street, and there were a lot of television lights. I parked my car, and I got out, and I asked a correspondent what was going on. He said, oh, don't you know, they've evacuated all the journalists. We can't go beyond this point. And I had this sense that, in many ways, to the same extent that I thought that the realities of places like Romania under Ceausescu and East Germany under Honecker and life behind the Iron Curtain, that I've always felt that important moments that affect the lives of people need to be seen. And so whether this was in America or not, and whatever rules there were, I just had this sort of profound feeling that this moment needed to be documented. I didn't want to cause a problem. I didn't want to get arrested. I didn't want to be a part of the scene. I didn't want to make anybody's life difficult. But I said to myself, well, maybe I can make a contribution here now. I can do something. And so I started heading east. I zigzagged, and as I got further east, now water and mud was almost up to my knees. And there was a lot of smoke. And I got to Lexington Avenue, and it was like a highway of ambulances and fire trucks heading south. And I saw this, now in front of me, I saw this sort of Goyesque, like Guernica-like scene of mangled iron and steel and smoke and fire, and a lot of this big barricade of policemen. And I didn't want to, I decided to lay low, to take this really slowly. I didn't want to create a problem. And at one point I saw a man with a fire uniform on with cameras around his neck, and he came through this barricade. And I said to myself, well, he's more friend than foe. He's a fellow photographer. And as he walked by me, I kind of walked out from underneath this dark awning, and I whispered, would you mind talking to me for a second? And I said, what's it like in there? And he said, he rolled his eyes. He said, you can't imagine. And I said, are there other photographers? He said, no, I don't think so. I haven't seen many people in there at all. And I said, my name's Peter Turnley. I'm a photojournalist. And he said, you're Peter Turnley? And I said, yes. And he said, and I don't say this it's just what happened. He said, you need to go make pictures. We need to see your pictures. He said, just follow me. Come behind me. So I walked right behind him, and we walked right through this barricade. So now I find myself right at the foot of Ground Zero. It's about 6:30, 7 o'clock at night. And I didn't see any other journalists. I've heard that there were a couple other photographers that night, but I'm actually not sure who they were. Yeah. Immediately I saw one photographer who took a picture with a flash at a triage center, and I saw this guy get manhandled by police and taken out. And I said to myself, Peter, just lay low. This isn't a good time to make a scene. And I said to myself, if you can be quiet and stay here all night, at first light tomorrow morning when the light comes up, there are going to be really important pictures to be made that that aren't going to be made otherwise. So I went up the steps of, it was a Brooks Brothers store, and it was surreal because as I got to the second floor, there was a display room of clothes, and it had, all the clothes had 2 inches of dust on top of them. And I went to this wall of windows that now were all blown out, and I'm looking right over Ground Zero. And I said, Peter, just sit down here and stay quiet and spend the night, and tomorrow morning, you'll make pictures. So I sat there all night long, and I made pictures from this vantage point. One of the things that really struck me was, this was the first night. It wasn't several days later when it suddenly became kind of known and heroic to go be a volunteer at Ground Zero. This was the first night. And what struck me was the quantity of men and women that were showing up using their God-given skills, crane operators, welders, construction workers, firemen, to do something right, to be helpful. And I said to myself, these are all people with families and children, bills to pay, and yet they're putting their life on the line. And it gave me this incredibly, in spite of the tragedy of that moment, it really gave me this kind of uplifting feeling. An African-American nurse walked by and saw me sitting without a mask, and she had a mask. And she said, baby, you don't have a mask, take my mask. And I remember saying to her, no, I can't do that. You need it. You take it. But it was just that loving gesture, and there was so much of that kind of thing. I sat there all night long by myself.
That had to have been...
It was very powerful.
It was like sitting in hell.
It was very powerful. And I fell asleep without knowing it, I suppose, at about 5:30 in the morning. And I woke up, and I looked at my watch, and it was 6:15, and now there was light. And I was kind of startled, and I said, Peter, you got to get out and work. I went out into the rubble of Ground Zero, and the first thing I saw was a fireman sitting, looking aimlessly out into the distance. He had what we call in war the 1,000-yard stare. It's a stare that people have when their life has been turned upside down and they don't really understand what they've experienced. And I made almost a whole roll of film of portraits of this man sitting in the rubble. This picture was published quite a bit, but it always sort of haunted me to know what was going on in his mind. About 6 months later, I get an email from a woman saying, Dear Peter, my name is Linda. We are so grateful for the picture that you made of Sal, who is my boyfriend, because we've never known where he was the night of 9/11, and he can't talk about it. And your picture is the only proof we have of what he was doing. Could you please send me a print? I would be very delighted, very grateful to have a print. So I wrote her back immediately saying, of course, I'll send you a print. I had every intention of doing it. And something came up, and I had to go out of town for a trip, and I forgot. About 3 months later, I got a new email. Dear Peter, I've got some sad news. Sal and I have broken up, but could you please still send me that picture? I would love to have the picture. Again, I sent her back a note. I'm sorry to hear about your news, but of course I'll send you the print. Had every intention of doing it. Again, I go away on a trip. Again, I forget. 3 months later, I get a new email saying, Peter, great news. Sal and I have gotten married. Could you please now send us the print? Well, now it had been about 9 months, and this whole experience of being by myself at Ground Zero that night had started to kind of come out of my pores. I didn't really understand all of my own emotions. And I really had a desire to talk to Sal, to know what he was thinking when I made that picture. I thought it might even sort of help me. So I emailed Linda immediately back and said, Linda, could you please send me your phone number? I need to talk to you. And she said, 2 seconds later, I get a message, a phone number. I pick up the phone, I call. Linda picks up the phone, and we talk for a second. I said, Linda, do you think I could talk to Sal? I'd really like to talk to him about what he was thinking that morning when I took that picture. And she said, well, Peter, he's not going to be able to talk about it. He won't talk about it, but he'd be delighted to say hello to you. So she hands me the phone, and this very gruff voice comes on the other line. He's a very sturdy-looking Italian-American guy, like sort of Rocky Stallone-looking kind of guy. And I said, Sal, this is Peter. He said, hey, Peter, it's nice to meet you. And I said, Sal, do you mind telling me what you were thinking about when I took that picture? And suddenly, a man starts to sob on the other end of the phone. It was just heartbreaking. It went on for a long period of time. And at one point, he gathered himself, and he said, my firehouse was one of the first firehouses to be called to the scene that day. And I was with my best friend, Nicky, who was another fireman, and he said, we lost Nicky that day, that night. And I looked for him, and I couldn't find him. And And he started to cry again. And I said, Sal, you know, you got to know you're a great man. You have a lot to be proud of. And again, there were some tears. And I had been doing a lot of work covering Harley-Davidson rallies. And Linda had told me that he rides a Harley. And I said, hey, Sal, what kind of Harley do you ride? And suddenly he kind of cleared up his voice. And so we talked a little bit about Harleys. Well, the most important point to me about this story is that I've never seen Sal since that morning. But every year on the anniversary of 9/11, wherever I am in the world, I call Sal and we talk. And he always invites me to go join him at a pub next to Ground Zero so we could drink to the people that were killed that day. And I've never been able to join him because I've always been away. But most importantly, it's because of photography and because of visual communication and this pursuit of trying to see what is happening in our world and interacting with the incredible people that I've had the good chance to meet, that I have a friend like Sal that I probably will have now for the rest of my life.
Yeah. Let me just ask you finally then, because this puts it in it. We talked earlier about this, about the work that you've done, having the things you did at the beginning of your career and the things you've done up to now in your career. There is a link, there is a theme, there is a flow to what you're doing, and you see it that way, don't you?
Well, photography has offered me an amazing sense of purpose for my life. The opportunity to share what I see and feel and perceive when it's wonderful, when it's beautiful, sensual, humoristic, tender, or when it's unjust, when it's wrong, when it involves human suffering and tragedy, a world that ought to be better, could be better. All of that is part of what has seemed to me just an amazing opportunity to make something out of my own existence.
Yeah. It's been damn good of you to talk to us about this. I really appreciate it. And I should say before we close, too, we'd like to thank Terry over here for letting us shoot in his barbershop and get a shot at him. All right? Okay? All right. Peter, thanks very much. It's been great.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Charted deep for the historic revelation of the HMS Investigator, a key piece in the establishment of Arctic sovereignty. Team with journalist Don Martin, the Underwater Archaeology Service of Parks Canada, and Federal Environment Minister Jim Prentice, as CPAC presents exclusive broadcast footage of this groundbreaking find. The Hunt for Investigator. See it on CPAC.